America's warning came months ago, delivered through tariff threats and sanction warnings aimed squarely at any nation considering a retreat from the dollar. Washington expected the usual outcome. Quiet compliance, nervous backpedaling, countries falling back in line rather than risk economic isolation. Instead, BRICS nations moved forward anyway, and the result is a $500 billion currency swap arrangement that represents one of the most significant challenges to dollar dominance in recent memory. To understand why this matters, it helps to understand how the dollar's grip on global trade actually works. For decades, even when two non-American countries traded with each other, the transaction often still ran through dollars. A Brazilian exporter selling soybeans to an Indonesian buyer might settle that trade in dollars, not because either country wanted American currency, but because the global financial system was built around dollar clearing. That dependency gave the United States extraordinary power, the ability to monitor, restrict, or completely cut off a country's access to international trade by controlling dollar-denominated payment channels. It's the mechanism that made sanctions against Russia and Iran possible, and it's the same leverage that has loomed over any nation considering economic policies Washington disapproves of. This new BRICS swap arrangement chips away directly at that mechanism. Central banks from Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and an expanding circle of partner economies can now exchange currencies directly with each other, without dollars acting as the necessary middle step. $500 billion in committed liquidity gives these countries a buffer, a way to settle trade and stabilize their currencies without relying on access to dollar markets that Washington could, in theory, restrict at any moment. For nations that have watched the United States freeze foreign reserves or cut countries off from international payment systems, that kind of independence isn't an abstract policy goal. It's a practical safeguard. The Trump administration's response followed a familiar pattern. Threats of tariffs as high as 100% against countries seen as participating in de-dollarization efforts. The logic was straightforward from Washington's perspective: make the cost of leaving the dollar system so high that no rational country would attempt it. But the strategy appears to have backfired. Rather than deterring BRICS members, the tariff threats seem to have reinforced exactly the concern driving them toward alternatives in the first place. That dependency on American-controlled financial infrastructure carries real political risk. When a government demonstrates a willingness to weaponize trade and financial access as routine policy tools, other nations don't simply accept the vulnerability. They look for ways to reduce it. This swap deal doesn't stand alone. It connects to a broader infrastructure that BRICS nations and their partners have been building over several years. The cross-border interbank payment system, often referred to as CIPS, has steadily grown as an alternative to the Western-dominated SWIFT messaging network, processing an increasing volume of international transactions outside traditional channels. The mBridge platform links central banks in China, the UAE, Thailand, and Saudi Arabia, allowing for near-instant cross-border settlement using digital currencies rather than traditional dollar clearing. BRICS Pay aims to extend similar independence down to everyday consumers and businesses, letting them transact internationally without dollar conversion. And various gold-backed settlement mechanisms have emerged as a hedge against currency volatility, giving participating nations another layer of insulation from dollar-centric risk. None of these systems alone would be enough to meaningfully challenge the dollar's position, but together they represent a coordinated, multi-pronged effort to reduce reliance on a financial architecture that the United States has increasingly used as a tool of geopolitical pressure. It's worth noting that none of this happened overnight. The dollar's share of global reserve holdings has been declining gradually for years, not through any single dramatic event, but through the steady accumulation of countries diversifying their reserves, adding gold, and building alternative payment relationships. Central bank gold purchases have reached levels not seen in decades, a quiet but telling indicator of where global confidence is shifting. What sets this moment apart from earlier predictions of dollar decline, predictions that have circulated for years without materializing into anything substantial, is the scale and coordination behind the current effort. This isn't one country making a symbolic break from dollar trade. It's a coalition of major economies, representing a significant share of global population and output, deliberately constructing parallel financial infrastructure with the explicit aim of reducing dependency on a currency increasingly tied to American political decisions. When a country can have its reserves frozen or its banks cut off from international payments due to a policy disagreement, it stops being simply a trading partner and starts being treated as a structural risk worth managing. There's a clear irony in how this situation has unfolded. The very policies meant to preserve American financial dominance, the tariff threats, the sanctions regime, the routine use of dollar access as a bargaining chip, appear to be accelerating the search for alternatives rather than preventing it. Each new threat from Washington becomes another argument finance ministers in Beijing, Moscow, Brasilia, and New Delhi can use to justify further investment in de-dollarized infrastructure. Threats work best against actors who have no alternative. Once an alternative exists, the threat loses much of its force, and that appears to be exactly what's happening here. Skeptics in Western financial circles continue to argue that this is overstated, that the dollar's position remains too deeply embedded in global finance to be seriously challenged by these developments. That argument carried more weight a decade ago, when most of this infrastructure existed only as proposals or pilot programs. Today, these systems are operational, processing real transactions and settling actual trade between major economies. A $500 billion swap commitment is not a symbolic gesture. It's a functioning financial mechanism that reduces, in concrete terms, how often dollar intermediation is actually necessary for a growing share of international trade. The implications extend beyond simple currency mechanics. As more nations calculate the trade-off between the convenience of dollar-based systems and the security of diversified alternatives, pressure builds on Washington to reconsider its approach. So far, that reconsideration hasn't materialized. The response has remained consistent: more tariff threats, more warnings, more attempts to penalize countries for pursuing financial diversification. Whether that approach changes will likely determine how quickly this transition continues, but the trend itself appears difficult to reverse at this point. The dollar's global dominance was built on the absence of viable alternatives, a system that functioned because no other currency or payment network offered comparable scale and reliability. That circumstance is changing, gradually but unmistakably. America issued its warning. BRICS nations proceeded regardless. And this $500 billion currency swap arrangement now stands as one of the clearest indicators yet that the financial order built around dollar supremacy is being reshaped, not through dramatic collapse, but through the steady construction of alternatives by the very nations it was designed to keep dependent. Explicit aim of reducing dependency on a currency increasingly tied to American political decisions. When a country can have its reserves frozen or its banks cut off from international payments due to a policy disagreement, it stops being simply a trading partner and starts being treated as a structural risk worth managing.